All right, so we are recording now. So I want to start by briefly introducing myself for those of you I've not worked with before. My name's Sarah Everman, and my background is I have a PhD in physiology from Arizona State University. And I've been a professor with the kinesiology program here at ATSU since 2011. So coming up on my 10-year anniversary in September, it's kind of crazy how the time flies. So I teach the research methods course. I teach both of the nutrition courses, the exercise science course, and a little bit of other things like metabolic conditioning and other things here and there. Um, but my background and my research has been in physiology and metabolism throughout my career. I started out looking at branched chain amino acid metabolism, so in a very sort of microscopic research line, and then moved into looking at more macroscopic considerations, cardiovascular fitness throughout aging. But I've always had a really particular interest in cellular processes and especially how those interact with nutrition. So inflammation is a hot topic in that space right now. And so we're going to get to talk about that today. And I think there's probably still more questions and answers on this topic, but that's what makes it so fun. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Trevor Benyon. And you can see a little bit more about his background in the module introduction as well as my week 7 announcement. But Dr. Benyon, would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you so much. I am so excited and happy to be here to talk about this kind of stuff. My scientific background, similar to Dr. Everman, is in metabolism. So I love that kind of stuff. I just can like endlessly geek out on all sorts of metabolism conversations. In addition to teaching at AT Still, I am on the editorial board for a few of the ACSM journals, and I also am part of the international task force for the upcoming 2022 health and fitness trends from the ACSM. But then in addition to my scientific contributions, I work very hard as a full-time artist. I paint, I draw, I take photos, I create video, I travel the world in pursuit of my next masterpiece. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm excited to talk about inflammation and all sorts of really cool stuff with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let me go ahead and give just sort of a brief introduction to our topic here today, and then we'll get into our questions. So today we're going to be discussing the physiology of inflammation, which includes both the positive and negative aspects. That's why you maybe saw in our title for this talk that it's inflammation, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there's definitely several aspects to it. So I'm going to ask Dr. B a series of questions here, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for all of you to ask us some questions. So let me start by just giving a very brief introduction to the concept of inflammation. When people typically hear that word, I think they typically assume or picture something negative or harmful. But it's very important to understand that the organism, not just us, but other organisms, initially developed these processes as an adaptive or healing process. So this set of mechanisms didn't come about for us to hurt ourselves. It came about as a way for the organism to heal itself. So today we're going to discuss what might cause inflammation to go from being adaptive and healing to harmful, and the various factors that play into where that falls on the spectrum that would make inflammation either restorative or maladaptive and harmful. So to start, Dr. B, can you please give us a brief summary of what is inflammation in terms of a definition from a physiological perspective?
Yes, inflammation is just in general, like in its most basic definition, it is the immune system's response to a foreign invader, a bacteria, virus, pathogen. It's the immune system's response to that sort of danger or also damage. So that, yeah, like Dr. Everman was just saying, like that is a very healing thing. If there is something invading our bodies that is dangerous or deadly, our immune system then responds to that. And so this is just inherently like that's a positive thing. There are physiological consequences to inflammation, though. It's kind of like if you were to go exercise right now, you know, your body would shift towards a more sympathetic nervous system response. So priorities would shift to allow your body to divert like blood flow, for example, to active muscle. And other priorities would be suppressed. So it's like this happens with all sorts of different bodily systems. The immune system is similar. So when you have an immune system response, there are things that are prioritized, actions that are prioritized, and other actions that are suppressed. And if that happens acutely, or if that happens just like in a response to something, and then you afterwards reset back to normal, then that's a healthy thing that just happened. However, if you have a chronic adaptation to this immune response, in other words, if this is like almost your way of living, then that's when those actions that are prioritized and those actions that are suppressed by virtue of this immune response, or at this point, an immune adaptation, a chronic inflammatory adaptation, then that could be a pretty dangerous way to live, to have certain actions be suppressed for the long term like that. So yeah, there's an acute inflammatory response, there's a chronic inflammatory adaptation. And so that's why things can get kind of confusing in terms of our perceptions of inflammation. It's very common with chronic diseases for there to be chronic inflammation. And so we hear about inflammation in that context, and that sounds really bad. So there's bad context or contextual instances where inflammation can be dangerous, and contextual instances where inflammation can be very healing. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, kind of circling back to what you were just saying, Dr. Everman, it really requires more contextual understanding for us to wrap our heads around good versus bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we're about to get into some more of that contextual aspect, and that's going to lead very nicely into the next question. I do want to add a little bit there too, though, in terms of like, you know, when we think of inflammation, I think it's also important to look at some of the specifics of what is actually happening. So, for example, one key response that tends to happen in an inflammatory setting if there's an injury or an infection at a site, let's say, so we're not talking about widespread bodily inflammation, but at a site, we get various vasodilators and capillary permeability mediators. So these proteins go into a tissue bed and cause the blood vessels to become more open. And as a consequence of that, we get things like swelling and water and edema in the space outside of the blood vessels. And we see that as swelling. That leads to controversies related to things like rice therapy, rest, ice, compression, elevation, because on the one hand, that capillary permeability is there for a reason. It allows white blood cells, T cells, mast cells to get to the site of the injury and do what they need to do. But on the other hand, if there's too much of it, then that extra fluid in the interstitial space can cause tissue damage. And so in that case, we want to apply some compression. But this is where all of you as clinicians, as practitioners, need to make a judgment about, do I want more inflammation for this healing aspect? Or do I want to restrict the inflammation, for example, with rice to prevent tissue damage? So that leads right into my next question for Dr. Benyon, because one of the key judgments you would have to make in choosing to apply rice or not is the time course. Did this just happen, or has this been happening for a long time? And so, Dr. B, can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between the acute and chronic inflammation in terms of what you would consider acute in terms of a time course, and what you would consider chronic in terms of a time course, and when would an acute injury or an infection transition to being considered chronic?
Absolutely. Man, guys, I love these questions. This is awesome stuff. So an analogy that I want to give for this is hypertrophy. All right. So like if I tell you guys like, all right, drop down 20 push-ups like right now. So you guys do 20 push-ups, you are using your muscles. That right there would be an acute muscular response. Like there are things happening in your bodies right now if you do 20 push-ups. Is hypertrophy the result? Do your muscles just grow in diameter? Probably not from just that one bout of exercise, because hypertrophy is a long-term adaptation. And so that is the buildup of multiple bouts of long-term kind of stimuli. Whereas that single stimulus is what's going to give us an acute response. So we have responses, which are acute, and we have adaptations, which are chronic. And so relating this back then to inflammation, similarly, we have inflammatory responses that are responding to acute stimuli. And then we have adaptations, these chronic inflammatory conditions that are responding to long-term multiple stimuli, bouts of stimuli over a long period of time. So similar to exercise, if you have, if you're exercising regularly, then you're going to have these long-term adaptations, cardiorespiratory adaptations, muscular adaptations. If you're in a state of damage or danger, like I was saying, is kind of the definition of the inflammatory response or the immune system. If you're in a long-term state of multiple bouts of danger or damage, then your body is going to have these chronic inflammatory conditions. So coming back to the answer here, to answer your question, long-term sort of an acute inflammatory response could be just from a single bout. This could be an inflammatory response that's a couple hours, maybe even a couple of days, whereas a long-term, a chronic inflammatory condition is something that's going to be a repeated multi-stimuli kind of condition over a much longer period of time.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I'm really kind of hearing in this discussion as well is that inflammation is a complicated thing to measure. So if we say that this person has more inflammation than someone else, I think we all, as consumers of the literature, need to rightly ask, how do you know, right? Like, how is that measured? And so this also gets to the point about exercise being a great example of an acute adaptive process. Exercise is another thing that's sort of hard to measure in terms of what it's doing, right? Even something like hypertrophy is controversial. There was a great point counterpoint article in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise last week where which I don't know if you guys have seen these point counterpoint articles where they choose a topic and then two groups of authors argue back and forth. But one of the counterpoint was that hypertrophy is not necessary for an increase in strength. And so that speaks to how do you measure things like muscle adaptation. For our purposes here today, though, we're talking about how do you measure inflammation. And so to measure the effects specifically of exercise on the inflammatory response, there's physiological markers such as superoxide dismutase, IL-6, TNF-alpha, which are some of the proteins that are measured in a muscle biopsy, a blood or saliva sample. And if you've watched my presentation so far already in the Week 7 Institute course, you'll see that I'm big into measuring proteins, right? Like proteins are the mediators of so much of what happens in our body. And I specifically mentioned superoxide dismutase because that's an enzyme that was measured by the group, Dr. Risto's group, which you have some papers in the Canvas course from that group to read about. And Dr. Benya and I are going to talk more about that research in just a minute. But those are some of the things that can be measured. So these proteins or cytokines are released in response to a variety of stimuli and can have differing effects based on both their target tissues as well as their physiological level, if you have a lot of them or a little of them. So for example, it's been shown in some studies that an increase in the enzyme superoxide dismutase, also called SOD, promotes an adaptive response when you have some of it, right? Sort of like the right amount of it, if you will. And that's been demonstrated by the fact that if you block the superoxide dismutase response as a result of exercise, then you minimize the adaptation to that exercise, in this case measured by an increase in insulin sensitivity. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But for now, Dr. Benyon, can you please describe for us some of the commonly used inflammatory markers and tell us what it may mean if their levels increase or decrease above a certain threshold? And if, as you're talking about this, you have time, can you comment on to what extent you think that there's a difference in the change in these markers between aerobic versus resistance exercise?
Awesome. I have a lot of things to say about that. And I will turn to you to like keep me anchored because there's a couple of questions there. This, man, okay, like as you were just describing that, like one of the things that came to my mind, just like fundamentally, like why we are here to talk about this. Not only is this a complicated issue where there's a lot of confusion, but as we were talking, like chronic inflammation can be bad, it can be dangerous. And in the past while, I mean, for years I've seen this, but especially in the past like year or 2 years, a lot of people have been really concerned about supporting their immune system, you know, understandably, rightfully so. And I've seen some wild stuff about exercise and exercise's role in this. People are now questioning, does exercise cause inflammation or reduce inflammation? And the answer is yes. And that's why this is kind of complicated. That's why we need to kind of dig deep and understand contextually what's going on. So that it's kind of like if, let's say the group of us here all do an exercise intervention, we all do the same exercise. And then I tell you guys a little report afterwards, and I'm like, all right, half of you had a muscular system response. Like that would be a weird thing for me to say. That would be very confusing. And also you probably would be like, wait, half of us, but we like all did the workout. How did half of us have a muscular, and what is a muscular response? Like we all were moving our muscles. So if I were to say, if you were reading the research and you came across something that there was an inflammatory response, it's kind of the same thing. That's like saying there was an immune system, something happened with the immune system. So it's like, well, what is the researcher trying to say? And that's where we can dig deeper as scientists and as students of science, like we're studying the peer-reviewed research to see what kind of inflammatory markers were measured across different studies. And so that's the researchers' way of communicating to us readers what they're trying to say when they are describing that there was an immune system response because of this exercise intervention or because of whatever intervention they were studying in their research. So there are many different proteins that are released from the immune system, these cytokines, and how they communicate amongst each other and really they tell the immune system different things, what to do, how to respond to a certain stimuli that is happening in the body. And so we can detect these patterns of these different inflammatory markers and then identify like, okay, this is happening. We measured the activity of this type of cytokine, and that indicates that there's a pro-inflammatory response. And then further, we can understand, okay, like what is that? How is that affecting the other target or the target cell, and perhaps a ripple effect across other different cell communication and stuff like that. And so there's different cytokines, different inflammatory markers that you'll come across in the research. And some of the ones that are probably the most, should be like on our radar in exercise science include, by the way, I've got here one of my favorite, this is one of my favorite books. This is the ACSM's Advanced Exercise Physiology text. It's so good, you guys. I strongly recommend. But just to read to you guys a little bit from here. That explains it. I was on the wrong page. So among the most important cytokines are the interleukins. So we've got like interleukin 1, 2, 6, 10, and the interferons. So IFN, gamma, beta, tumor necrosis factor. Dr. Everin was just talking about TNF alpha. So these are common. I feel like every time I read an article about exercise and inflammation, it's always talking about interleukin 6. And so some of the things that I want to share with you guys about this in relation to exercise, and then also to circle back on one of the questions you asked, Dr. Everman, about the role of exercise and its impact on inflammation and resistance versus cardio. So it depends on what our stimulus is, what our action is, and how that's going to result in our immune system communicating amongst itself to figure out the best course of action. And so we have activities that are going to be pro-inflammatory and also things that are going to be anti-inflammatory. And the thing about exercise is there is oxidative stress that occurs when we are aerobically metabolizing substrates to produce energy. But then at the same time, exercise can be an anti-inflammatory activity over time. And so to kind of connect these dots at a more zoomed out level to allow us to contextually understand more specific conversation, I want to jump to the part of the question that was about exercise intensity and exercise type. So again, I just wanted to read this to you guys here, straight out of the text. During both moderate and intense exercise, and I'll define moderate and intense in a moment, lymphocytes are mobilized to the blood compartment. However, dynamic exercise of relatively high intensity, lasting more than an hour, so they define that as greater than 70% of VO2 max. So it's more than 70% of your VO2 max for 1 hour or greater will induce a decrease in the circulating number of lymphocyte after exercise. Thus, lymphocytes disappear from the circulation in the recovery period, but only if the exercise has been intense. After heavy exercise, lymphocyte and natural killer cell function is also impaired as assessed by in vitro assays. Thus, after intense long duration exercise, the immune system is temporarily impaired. This period is sometimes called the open window. During this open window of altered immunity, which may last 3 to 72 hours, depending on the parameter measured and the duration and intensity of the exercise, viruses and bacteria may gain a foothold, increasing the risk of subclinical or clinical infection. Further, it says heavy exercise can have negative effects on the immune system, leading to immune suppression and loss of lymphocytes from the circulation. So, in other words, exercise has moderate intensity exercise, which would, for what these guys were describing, would be below that 70% VO2 max intensity, had a positive impact on circulating lymphocytes. But when you exceeded that threshold, it then became, it impaired the immune system response for 3 to 72 hours. So to come back to that question, like what happens if you are doing resistance training or cardio? It kind of just depends on the duration of exercise, the intensity of that exercise, and the way in which you're contracting your muscles. And if you're running downhill and doing a lot of eccentric stuff, or doing a lot of heavy lifting and doing a lot of like kind of resisting the gravity, like a lot of eccentric movement. So it kind of depends on the different types of exercise. But the thing that should matter most, the thing that we need to put on our radar, is the intensity and duration. So intensity and duration. Oh, Sarah, were you going to say
No,
something?
I was just going to agree actually that I think where I'm seeing you kind of going here is towards a concept that I really like about that everything in physiology is on a spectrum. And I feel like that spectrum is sort of like one of those scales, with a little balance thing in the middle, which is homeostasis. And so physiology needs to have not too little and not too much. And exercise pushes that homeostatic set point in a way that can be adaptive if there's not too much of it. So just one thing I'd like to add to all the great points Dr. Benyon just made is that I mentioned superoxide dismutase, and I bring this up again because we're about to talk about it a little bit more in the context of Dr. Michael Ristow's work, who he was at Harvard at the time of this work, and he's one of the leaders in this area. But in terms of the mechanism of aerobic exercise and its relation to inflammation, because I certainly agree with Dr. B that I think aerobic exercise has more excess inflammatory risk than resistance exercise, which tends to be shorter duration. And part of the mechanism for that comes back to the mitochondria, which I talk about in my recorded institute presentation, where when you metabolize fuel to create ATP for an aerobic event, you run a lot of electrons through the inner mitochondrial membrane. And there's a hypothesis that if you do that a lot at a high intensity and or a long duration, you can have some what's called electron leak. So some electrons escape that mitochondrial space and become what's called reactive oxygen species, or ROS, which are one of the triggers for an inflammatory response. And superoxide dismutase is an enzyme that essentially scavenges those free radicals and therefore reduces their number. And so if you have more of this superoxide dismutase enzyme in your body, you're going to be better able to scavenge free radicals. So that's how exercise can be acutely damaging, but adaptive in the long run. And what's interesting is I've heard some people hypothesize that this is one of the ways that exercise is protective against things like, bear with me here, but pollution, bad food, other things that would cause an inflammatory response or create reactive oxygen species. If you're somebody who exercises, you have more SOD to deal with that. Now, the flip side is that, as I just mentioned, reactive oxygen species and other immune triggers can come from multiple things, not just exercise, viruses, pathogens in the environment, environmental toxins, bad food, etc. And those can create things like reactive oxygen species, ROS, which we tend not to want. Again, it kind of goes back to that mindset of what's bad. And so as a consequence, people will take antioxidants or anti-oxidative species, such as vitamin C and vitamin E. So Dr. Ristow and his team wanted to do a study to see if you take these these exogenous anti-ROS mediators, are you going to suppress the endogenous anti-ROS pathways? And so that's exactly what they looked at in the studies that are linked in the Canvas course. And so this group gave participants in an exercise program high-dose antioxidant supplements, in this case, vitamin C and vitamin E, in the time period immediately after exercise. And they showed that the exercise adaptation, as measured by an increase in superoxide dismutase and an increase in insulin sensitivity, was blunted in the groups that took those antioxidant supplements. So, for another charged question from Dr. Benyon, what are your thoughts on this area of research in terms of its practical application, right? It's kind of interesting in a lab setting, but what does it mean for us practically? And do you think that, again, in a practical setting, antioxidant supplements have a large enough effect on these responses to create a meaningful difference for clients or athletes? And if so, what do you recommend as a strategy to deal with this problem of capitalizing on the exercise adaptation, but also, especially in our current climate, being interested in things like vitamin C supplements?
Such an exciting question, series of questions. Yeah, so there's at this point multiple studies to support that the evidence that supplemental vitamin C or supplemental antioxidants like right around the time of exercise can impair some of these exercise outcomes. And so it's one of those things where so you asked, what's the practical strategy about this? For if somebody's taking like a pre-workout supplement, if somebody's into the whole supplement world, and they're exercising a lot, chances are they're probably into pre-workout, post-workout recovery kind of stuff as well. So they may not think like about taking like, slamming 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C before they work out, but it may be in their pre-workout, so just be more cognizant of a consumer to see like what is in this whole spread of ingredients in your pre-workout supplement. But then also a practical strategy, if you're looking to, and let's just say there's some sort of clinical therapeutic value that somebody, like let's say somebody's doctor is like, I want you to take 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C. Then that person is like, all right, well, how do I, and let's say they've read these studies and they're thinking, how do I exercise now? Then what they could do is separate the times of day. So if you're going to take your vitamin C stuff in the early morning, then, or if you're going to work out in the afternoon or evening, then take your vitamin C first thing in the morning. Or if you are an early morning exerciser, then consider taking your vitamin C later in the day, to allow your body to have that time to kind of separate that. I'm trying to think of some of the other questions you said. Did that answer generally yes, or was there something? Is there anything I'm missing?
No, that does answer it. And I think since we have lots more to unpack here, we'll kind of keep going. But one thing that I like in what you said is that, it just, people think that, oh, I just take the pre-workout, my doctor just tells me to take a supplement, like, it's fine. But really, I think what we as physiologists appreciate is that even in something as simple as a vitamin C supplement, you need to have a little bit more physiological knowledge than maybe the average person, because as Dr. Benyon just said, if you take your vitamin C separated by 4 to 6 hours from your exercise, it should not have this negative effect that we see in these studies. And that's in part due to the fact that vitamin C is a water-soluble compound. And so it's absorbed and metabolized relatively quickly by comparison to something like vitamin D that's not a water-soluble compound. And so that might have a different time course. And so just having a little bit of education around what these things are and what they do, I think is so important. So along with that, we're going to keep making it more complicated here. So far, we've essentially talked about the good of inflammation, right? It's adaptive and it's healing processes. And we've talked a little bit about the bad in terms of how too much exercise or taking your vitamin C at the same time as the exercise can lead to some, less than ideal outcomes. But now let's shift gears a little bit, again, especially in this era that we're in right now where the immune system is kind of front and center in everyone's mind. And let's talk about what we're calling the ugly side of inflammation, which for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, Dr. Benyon and I are kind of loosely defining as some of the effects of the Western diet and lifestyle on these processes. So in particular, I think that insulin is an important mediator of some of these things. We haven't talked about insulin too much yet, but I did mention the fact that one of the ways that Dr. Risto and colleagues measured whether there was a positive outcome or not from the exercise was if the participant's insulin sensitivity went up or down. And for those of you that have taken the nutrition courses already, we talk a lot about insulin. So for just the limited scope we have today, we're going to look at the effect of insulin on insulin. So to this point, it's important to be mindful as well of our scope of practice. Again, if you've taken the nutrition courses, we talk about within your scope of practice, in most cases, it's not appropriate to be prescribing a diet to people. And it's also not appropriate, unless you're a physician in most cases, to be commenting on the disease outcome of an immune process, right? So I'm going to let Dr. B talk about this a little bit more, but there's a better way to approach these topics than what we commonly see on the interwebs, which is to discuss these things in mechanistic and educational terms, such as we're doing today. So speaking of a mechanism, Dr. B, can you please describe the role of insulin in mediating the inflammatory response, as we've discussed here, in the context of the ugly, right? And I mentioned insulin because it's a widely recognized junction point between many metabolic responses, the intersection again between diet and lifestyle. And so, to what extent do you think there's a connection between dietary factors, insulin, and inflammation? And how can we tackle this within our scope of practice?
Oof. Wow. Again, these questions are so fantastic. I hope you guys watching this are enjoying this. This is fun stuff. I encourage you guys to like also like dig into the research on this. This is exciting. It's fun, and it's relevant. This is important for us to understand, to just talk about general conversations about health, whether you're super into like immunology or not. Like this is just super helpful stuff to understand about just health. Um, yeah, like Sarah, you were saying, like just Western diet. Like we eat food multiple times a day, every day. So like our food decisions play a role in inflammation. But then also, yeah, exercise and everything. Okay, anyway, to answer your question, oh my goodness. Um, I would say, just to generally like summarize, because I know we're like pushing our time already. Um, Part of the, okay, so like I said in the very beginning, when you have an immune response, when your immune system is triggered to do something, it's going to prioritize certain actions and it's going to suppress other actions to do its job well. And part of that whole cascade of things includes a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol's one of its primary functions is it's a survival thing, to allow your brain to have the fuel it needs. Cortisol is triggered when your body is low on glucose. Well, that's one of the ways in which cortisol can increase. When you're low on glucose, because your brain needs a steady stream of blood glucose to fuel it. So if your blood glucose is low, cortisol goes up. If you're low on carbs and low on glycogen, like cortisol goes up. And so part of that, it doesn't, cortisol doesn't want your body like unnecessarily taking up glucose. It wants to preserve it for your brain. And so it is going to suppress insulin, because insulin is going to allow glucose to be taken up at the cellular level throughout the body. And so we want to avoid that because we want to divert all available glucose to the brain. So cortisol and inflammation are also intertwined. This is cortisol is going to go up, and that's just part of that whole series of actions that are going to be encouraged during inflammation and other things that are going to be suppressed. Insulin is going to be suppressed during inflammation. And so when you have a chronic inflammatory condition, you are chronically suppressing your body's communication with insulin, which is going to create its own kind of cascade of miscommunications with insulin, which can be connected to a resistance toward that. Your body can develop a resistance towards that. In other words, insulin resistance. And food, the food choices we make, there are so many amazing studies out there that describe and measure for inflammatory markers after eating certain foods. And so if there's a food that you eat and it spikes an inflammatory response, and it's like some nasty junk food, but it's like, you know, like, I don't know, like if that's the thing that now you need to make a change in your diet because you're like, oh man, that's my favorite food. I eat it like 3 times a day. And I've been doing that for 10 years. Then like, that's probably a really destructive habit, you know? And so our food choices can influence inflammatory responses in the body. Inflammatory responses repeatedly can turn into chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation can suppress our insulin responses, and it skew the communication with insulin, thus resulting in a resistance to insulin, cascading in. At this point now, we're talking like multiple chronic diseases. So that's kind of a general summary of my answer to your question, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I'm really glad you mentioned cortisol. Honestly, I'd say to be fair, we haven't talked about it enough in this past 45 minutes or so, it's really important. And we could certainly do an entire hour just on cortisol. So if any of you are interested in learning more about this connection between inflammation, Western diet, um, insulin, cortisol, and health, I strongly recommend a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's a heavy read, so it's not a science textbook, but it's also probably not for a lay person necessarily who has no background in what is cortisol or not. It's written by a professor at Stanford who's done some amazing work. And we've talked about the difference between acute and chronic inflammation. And basically what the book says is that why zebras don't get ulcers is because when zebras have a spike in cortisol because a lion's attacking them, it's either quickly over or the zebra's quickly over. Like there's no such thing as an ongoing tiger problem, right? At least for that day. Whereas humans have this chronic, like you have finals week and then you have a fight with your partner and then you have a stressful job and so you have a chronic inflammatory problem. But so anyway, that book goes into way more detail about it than we can here today. So I strongly recommend that. But since we are running out of time and winding this down a little bit, we're going to kind of steer a little bit more away from the science aspect of it. We've talked about mechanisms, we've talked about proteins, and Dr. Benny and I both spend an hour or so in our recorded presentations nerding out on you with all of that stuff as well. So as we kind of wind this down, I'd like to ask Trevor, what are some things you do in your own life, right? So kind of taking off your scientist hat and moving more into the bro science or the biohacking realm. I'm asking you to go a little bit outside that evidence-based lane. And if you can give our audience here today some do try this at home takeaway points. In particular, are there any specific dietary or lifestyle patterns that you think make a big impact on these outcomes or that you use in your own life?
I love all these questions so much. I would say, I wouldn't like the advice I would give is to love food, cook your own food. And I am such a foodie. I love to cook. I love to eat good food. And I'm obsessed with that. If I'm going to eat food 3 times a day, I want it to be good. And I just love cooking food and pushing it to the tastiest limits I can figure out in the kitchen, So when you cook your own food though, you are in control of what's in that food. And so I think that's one of the simplest things we can do is to avoid junk food, avoid fast food, avoid processed, overly processed, heavily processed things by simply cooking it ourselves. But then also, so yeah, cook food. That's one thing I would say. And then another thing I would say is regularly exercise. And it can be just as simple as that. I don't even need to tell you, there's no anti-inflammatory workout, kind of a thing that I'm trying to say. It's simply as moderate intensity exercise. I was just when I read that little citation from this book. But then as you build your cardiorespiratory fitness, as you build your capacity to handle more intense stuff, as your cardiorespiratory fitness goes up, then that relative intensity window within which you can positively have an immune safety zone, right, is also going to go up. So your ability to do more work in a healthier way that supports your immune system is also going to improve. Also, the flip side of that, being sedentary is super dangerous for your immune system. So regularly exercise, cook your own food. I'm just going to leave it as simple as that.
I love it. I love it. And I'll just add one more because I think, and I know you'll agree with this, Trev, is that they're sort of like the big 3. And for me, the only one of the big 3 that you didn't touch on there is sleep. I think sleep is just absolutely critical. And the reason I pull that here into this conversation is because another aspect of cortisol that we didn't get a chance to touch on today is that cortisol follows a diurnal rhythm.
Mhm.
So cortisol is meant to peak in the morning hours and it's meant to be low in the evening hours. And so much of our Western lifestyle puts us in situations that are relatively stressful later in the day, leading to cortisol peaks essentially throughout the daylight cycle, which is really bad for the cortisol diurnal rhythm. Not to mention, sleep in general is so important. That's another topic that we could easily spend an hour on. And there's a great book, I'll give you one for that as well, by Professor Matt Walker, who's from the UK. I think he was at Oxford for a while. I'm not sure where he is now. It's called Why We Sleep. I thought it was going to be basic in the sense of like, we get tired. I don't know. Um, but it's a phenomenal book. He's an excellent researcher. He's done some of the most detailed research on sleep, the difference between REM sleep, non-REM sleep. So again, just kind of putting the cap here on everything that Dr. D has shared with us here. In my mind, the big three are sleep, nutrition, and exercise. If I personally had to rank them, which I'll throw this back to Trev real quick, if I personally had to rank them, I'd put sleep 1, nutrition 2, and exercise as the third priority if I could only have 2 in a day. So Trev, what's your ranking of the big three there?
I would I agree with you on sleep, but I would switch exercise. I put as number 2. Um, hmm. I'm not even going to answer that because I know that I just want to like keep talking for like 10 more hours
Yeah.
about this.
No,
Man,
well, that's funny that you say that, you put exercises too, because I'm also a proponent of intermittent fasting, which would play along with, well, I guess you don't need to eat that badly, right? So, all right. Let's turn it over to the group here. Anyone have questions for either Dr. Benyon or I, or both of us?
The timing of supplementation,
Mhm.
because a lot of times, especially in team environments, it's habitual, right? You come in, there's, everybody's getting prepped. They're walking into the training room, they're going through the supplements, getting their stuff, or they're grabbing it when they finish. And it's a real habit oriented situation because they're trying to get something as opposed to nothing. But from what you're describing, there's a real need to pay attention to it. So do we need to create the habit around multiple different times and things they're taking at those times?
Trev, please.
I like this question that has popped in there. The answer is yes. Like we need to be aware of this kind of stuff. But like the question here, the obstacle that you're describing is the habit, the ritual, the team camaraderie, the habits that are there sometimes out of I say necessity. Like if they are doing something as a team, then compared to this, maybe if they missed that, then they wouldn't get whatever supplement, they might miss that chance to consume that. It depends on the supplement. I wonder if in that team context, 1,000 milligram vitamin C tablets are part of the routine. Like probably not, but like if it is, then like, oh my goodness, yeah, that conversation needs to happen.
No, just to give you a sense, like literally you've got practice at 11, guys are showing up at 8:30, 9 o'clock. And before 11, there's a meeting or whatever. So you've got a period of time, about 90 minutes or so, where guys are coming in. Some of them want to get taped, treated, whatever's happening. Social, there's a whole social environment, but it's all different. And at the same time, in another room, you've got the gym and the athletes, like they're training. And then afterwards, there's a little bit of recovery, a little bit of training. Everyone's kind of on a somewhat individual scale, but there's groups of people that are going through it. And for the most part, when they go into the training room prior to practice, prior to the meeting, you take your pick. You've got, vitamin C sitting there, vitamin D, there's a suite of different things. And they'll just basically go through the little contraption that stores it and grab 5, 6 different things because they want to get the whole multivitamin type approach. But it's all happening and being consumed. For the most part, I would say this is well over half of them prior. And that's within 60 minutes of the practice.
I would say that one of the most important pieces there is that education piece, that more is not always better. So if this is the opportunity for them to like load up on whatever supplements are available, and they're just like, sweet, I'm gonna, take advantage of this opportunity and get as much as I can, then that education piece, like more is not always better. But then to let them know and to continue that education piece, like, hey guys, if you're gonna take some vitamin C, like literally like take it in your hand, not consume it. But if you're gonna take it off the shelf, keep that one in your pocket for like, 12 hours later.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think this is a great example of where maybe leveraging all the tracking technology that we wear on ourselves constantly now would work, where you have the whole team set a reminder to take your vitamin C at 7 o'clock at night, kind of thing.
Cool.
In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question here from Trisha. So, Dr. B, how does raw fermented foods and fiber interact with inflammation cycles?
This one, I really appreciate this question. I need to like think this through for a minute. Do you want to address this while I like soak this in?
Yeah, I think why we're both a little stumped with this question is I'm not sure that this is known, right? Like I'm not sure that I've seen a study that's convinced me one way or the other that say fermented foods, which keep in mind I am like the largest fan of kombucha there is. So, so I just put that disclaimer out there, like I'm a hound for kombucha. But I'm not sure that I've seen anything that tells me that kombucha, for example, decreases inflammation. Now, what I can do is put my think like a physiologist hat on and say, well, excess insulin has been shown to be pro-inflammatory, and raw foods, high fiber foods, fermented foods tend to create a lower insulin response than foods with lower fiber. And so by extension, more fiber means less insulin, likely means less inflammation. But I can't point you to a study that shows that.
Well said.
All right, Dr. B, I'm going to give you the next question then, because we're going to keep moving on here. So this is from Jules. Do previous injuries create the inflammatory response during exercise? And is this a risk for creating more chronic adaptive responses that are dangerous? If so, how to avoid? Is this a situation where rice is more beneficial?
Ooh, this is good. Let me see this again real quick here. Okay, during exercise. This is a really great question. I feel like this one I want to divert to like a physical therapist or something like that, who would probably have this answer like right in their back pocket all the time. I would say that there is the potential for this. So if you have, if you broke a bone in your arm and you're lifting weights with that arm, but that bone is like pretty healed enough for you to do that activity, then there's the potential that the stress is going to be greater in that arm compared to the other arm. There's the potential of that. It depends on the healing process. It depends on the extent of the healing process. It depends on the extent of the stressor during exercise, on the sensitivity of that previously injured site. So I would say for sure, like there's that potential where you could experience greater recurring inflammation at that site. And I think then,
So if I could kind of jump in here just to, because I like what I think I hear you emphasizing, Trevor, that this is sort of a clinical decision. This is why all of you are the professionals, and you need to look at athletes and people on a case-by-case basis. And I think the example of like a broken bone versus a tissue injury is important because, for example, I've taught the physiology and pathophysiology for the DPT students on the ATSU Mesa campus for a long time, and this is a question that comes up a lot. And again, it goes back to why they pay you guys the big bucks, right? Like why you're the professional decision makers, because if you have a patient or an athlete, let's say, who has had a previous soft tissue injury. And so now maybe there's, a little more interstitial space, right? There's been previous edema, there's some damage to the tissue, some scar tissue, some problems in that area. And so they're going to be more likely to have recurring swelling there. Then I would speculate, right? Like, this is my professional opinion, not based on X study. My professional opinion would be, in that case, you might want to use a RICE therapy to minimize additional swelling and additional trauma in that area. By comparison, if you have a fresh injury, so this is, some young buck who's lucky enough to have never sprained their ankle before, and this is the first time they've sprained their ankle, and it happened yesterday, this is where we see some therapies now using alternating heat and ice. So the heat increases the capillary permeability, brings more of those healing factors there, and then the ice keeps the edema in check. So in that case, I might decide, okay, we're going to alternate heat and ice, or maybe just heat, no ice. But again, it's that context that we're seeing. Dr. B, got anything to add to that?
Nope, you nailed it.
All right, I'm going to pause the recording here. I don't want to. All right, so as I said, I'm going to turn off the recording. For those of you who were not able to join us today, I really hope that you appreciated these conversations. We are going to stay on for a few more minutes for those of you who are here that just kind of would like to talk. But if you're joining us via the recorded version later and you have additional questions, I put in the Module 7 announcement how you can get in touch with me or Dr. B if you would like to shoot us questions later, or certainly if any in this group, if you think of questions later, please follow up with us. Both of our emails are available. We'd love to have these discussions continue, especially since I think we're all disappointed to be missing the Institute week in person, right? That's such a great time that we have together, and we're not able to do that right now. So we miss that. Try to keep the interaction going as much as possible this week. Also, especially because in the Canvas course, I gave you a break from discussions this week. I know that you have a lot of discussions, so I wanted to balance, the interaction that I'd like us to have with not overburdening you with that. So reach out to us if you'd like to keep this conversation going. And Dr. Benyon, before I end the recording here, would you like to say a little bit about what you do with Fit and Fizz and what you've got available for our students?
Yes, thank you. And I hope to hear from all of you. Just to echo your last words there, I encourage all of you to send us your questions, reach out to us, keep this conversation going. In my so I pre-recorded a lecture about calories, and I'm super passionate about calories and metabolism and all that stuff. And kind of a similar thing, like there is way more to be said about calories than the time duration of my presentation. And so to keep that conversation going, I also run this online health and fitness business called Fitness and Physiology. And I'm offering I create these online lecture series, and I'm offering the calorie one to you guys in this Summer Institute for free as our means of keeping that conversation going. And then but you have to sign up in a little waiting list by the end of the month. So I'll give you a few extra days. By September 1st, that opportunity is long gone. So if you want to keep in contact with me, keep maybe we're talking about calories, maybe we're talking about inflammation or some of these other topics, then doing that through Fit and Fizz is going to be a great way for us to keep in contact and keep these conversations going. And that you can sign up on that waiting list to have a free access to the calories course at fitandphys.com/ATSU. And that URL only exists for the next few days.
Yeah, and the link to Fit and Fizz is in the module announcement as well. So definitely check that out. Also in the module announcement is a link to thank you, Trevor. It's in the chat there for all of you who are here and can see that. And definitely go check this content out. I mean, you'll really quickly see the difference between my recorded presentation and Trevor's in terms of the production value. And that's just a tiny taste of what you're going to get at Fit and Fizz. So yeah, I've got to say, I can't recommend it highly enough. But also in the Module 7 announcement is a link to our ATSU Kinesiology Networking Facebook page. That's a great way to stay in touch with us. You'll see the cover photo is a previous Institute's group picture back in an era before COVID. We got everyone together. We, took that group picture, plugged the Facebook page. And so you have to request to join. I'll approve you, but please stay in touch with us there as well. So as I said, I'm going to stop the recording here, but we can stay and have an ongoing conversation. So please, again, my plug to everyone watching this later on, please stay in touch. Send us a shout out, Facebook, Fit and Fizz, our emails, anywhere. Trevor, any last words?
Be good people, exercise regularly, be good students, read research.
Awesome. All right. On that, I'm stopping the recording. Thank you, everyone, for watching.